It's one of the most famous songs in rock history, but it was also a declaration of war. How did a track built from the sounds of a cash register become the first shot in a battle that would tear Pink Floyd apart? And what was it about its strange, lurching rhythm that sparked a feud between two of rock's greatest titans? This wasn't just a song buried on side one of The Dark Side of the Moon. It was a bitter creative dispute, a toxic seed that with every jingle of a coin pushed the band closer to its spectacular implosion.
We share the same sense of humour to some extent. We lust after money to some extent.
This is the story of how the song Money almost destroyed one of the greatest bands in history. To really get the fight over money, you have to understand where Pink Floyd was in 1972. They were a band in transition, still finding their identity after the tragic departure of their original leader, Syd Barrett. With the 1971 album Medal, they had taken a huge creative leap forward, especially with the sprawling epic Echoes. That track proved they could function as a collaborative unit, but under the surface, the ground was already starting to crack. A new dynamic was taking hold, and it centered on two opposing forces, Roger Waters and David Gilmour. Waters, the bassist, was stepping up as the main lyricist and conceptual visionary. He saw rock as a vehicle for huge ideas, for dissecting modern life, madness, and mortality, the very themes that would define the dark side of the moon. He was the architect, drawing the blueprints for what Pink Floyd should say. On the other side was David Gilmour. After replacing Barrett, his virtuosic, soulful guitar playing and smooth vocals had become the definitive sound of Pink Floyd. Where Waters was the intellect, Gilmour was the instinct, the raw musical heart of the band. He cared less about grand concepts and more about melody, emotion, and pure sonic power. For a little while, these two forces were in a perfect, if tense, balance. But as they walked into Abbey Road Studios in the summer of 1972, that balance was about to be shattered, and the catalyst was a prissy little demo Waters had cooked up in his garden shed. The whole thing started with Roger Waters tinkering with a bass riff. But this wasn't your standard rock and roll line. It was in a jarring, asymmetrical time signature that most sources call 7/4. Now, for anyone who isn't a musician, just know that almost all the popular music you've ever heard is in 4/4 time. It's that steady, predictable, 4 beats to a bar rhythm that our brains are wired to love. It's the pulse of rock, pop, and blues. 7 beats to a bar, however, feels off. It has a lurching, stumbling quality, like it's always tripping over its own feet. You can count it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, but it never quite lands where your brain expects it to. When Waters brought his demo to the band, they were skeptical. David Gilmour, especially, found the rhythm awkward and unnatural. The band struggled to lock into the groove. This was the first shot in the creative war. Waters was pushing the band into uncomfortable intellectual territory, sacrificing a natural feel for a conceptual point. The lopsided rhythm was supposed to mirror the crass, unsettling nature of money itself. But for a musician like Gilmour, who ran on pure feel, it was a problem. He later said, "Roger came in with the verses and lyrics for Money more or less completed. We just made up middle sections, guitar solos and all that stuff." That stuff he so casually mentions would become the heart of the battle for the song's soul. The weird rhythm was just the beginning. The recording of Money became a perfect snapshot of the band's growing conflict, a clash between Waters' rigid concepts and Gilmour's musical intuition. It started with that iconic intro. That rhythmic clatter of cash registers and coins wasn't a stock sound effect. It was an analog marvel, painstakingly built by engineer Alan Parsons.
But I worked very hard to make sure that I never missed a Pink Floyd session because I didn't want to share the credit with anybody else.
He and the band spent days recording individual sounds, tearing paper, coins thrown into a mixing bowl, the whir of a machine, and the ka-ching of a register. Then came the truly mind-bending part. In an era before digital editing, Parsons had to physically measure the strips of tape with a ruler to make sure each sound landed perfectly in the 7-beat rhythm. He then spliced the pieces together by hand with a razor blade into a massive tape loop that was so long it had to be spooled around microphone stands in the studio to keep it from tangling. The band then had to play along to this physical loop, using it as a primitive, clunky click track. It was an incredible piece of innovation, but also incredibly high pressure. One wrong cut and the whole thing was ruined. This meticulous approach was pure Waters, but as the song took shape, Gilmour fought back. He knew that the claustrophobic 7/4 rhythm couldn't last the whole song. It needed a release, a moment of explosive freedom. So, he made the single most important decision in the song's arrangement. For the guitar solo, the time signature would switch to a hard-driving, conventional 4/4. This shift is what makes the song a masterpiece. It yanks the listener from the tense, cerebral verses into a cathartic, blues rock explosion. It was Gilmour, the musician, fighting for what the song needed to feel right, pushing back against Waters' rigid concept. This wasn't just an arrangement choice, it was a philosophical battle. The arguments got so frequent that keyboardist Rick Wright and drummer Nick Mason were often caught in the crossfire, their own contributions getting lost in the escalating feud between the band's two leaders.
We do have infighting. But you mean without actually exploding?
The final battleground was the mix itself. After all the fights over rhythm and structure, it came down to how the final song should sound. Waters, the lyricist, wanted his bass and the vocals, the message, to dominate. Gilmour, the instrumentalist, fought for a more atmospheric, guitar-heavy sound. The arguments got so heated that Alan Parsons and another engineer, Chris Thomas, had to act as mediators. In the end, they reached a truce, but it was a fragile one. Each man felt he had compromised his vision for the song. The mix they landed on was brilliant, but getting there had left deep scars. And then came the grand, crushing irony. Money, a song written as a cynical satire of greed, became Pink Floyd's first American hit single. It was the track that broke them in the US, launching The Dark Side of the Moon into a commercial stratosphere nobody saw coming. The lyrics, "Grab that cash with both hands and make a stash," were meant as a warning, but they became a prophecy. The band that prided itself on making album-oriented art music now had a hit single. The very thing Waters was critiquing was making them unbelievably rich. This sudden success didn't heal the rifts that had formed. It poured gasoline on the fire. Now there wasn't just creative control to fight over. There was a global empire and vast fortunes at stake. The war over money set a toxic precedent that would define the rest of Pink Floyd's career. The battle lines drawn in 1972 would only get deeper. The core conflict, Waters' lyrical dominance versus Gilmour's musical authority, was never resolved. On their next album, Wish You Were Here, the arguments continued. By the time they recorded Animals in 1977, Waters was tightening his grip, taking writing credits on nearly every track. Keyboardist Richard Wright's creative input was almost completely sidelined. The breaking point, of course, was The Wall. Conceived almost entirely by Waters, the project saw him complete his takeover. Tensions became so unbearable that Waters pressured Richard Wright into resigning during the sessions, with Wright only returning as a salaried musician for the tour. Ironically, this meant Wright was the only band member who actually made a profit from the money-losing tour. Gilmour, feeling more and more like a session player in his own band, clashed bitterly with Waters over the album's direction. The final album of the classic lineup, 1983's The Final Cut, was a Pink Floyd album in name only. It was essentially a Roger Waters solo record, and the vibe was so bad the band never even toured for it. 2 years later, Waters quit the band, assumed it would die without him, and then sued his former bandmates to stop them from using the Pink Floyd name.
We are Pink Floyd, Roger's left. It's a very simple matter. In my mind, it's a simple matter. It's a rock and roll group. Someone's left, the others get to carry on.
Decades later, the ghost of money still lingers. Both Waters and Gilmour have re-recorded the song on their own, as if to finally create the definitive version the other had prevented them from making. It's a testament to how deep the scars from that original conflict really run.